Chicago Tonight, Black Voices is made possible in part by Fifth Third Bank and by the support of these donors.
At Fifth Third, we believe when diverse voices are heard and empowered, communities are made stronger, lives are made better, and the future holds greater promise for all. That's why we're proud to support Chicago Tonight Black Voices. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we can drive change.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight Black Voices. I'm Brandis Friedman and thanks for sharing part of your weekend with us. On the show tonight, the calls for federal charges against former police officer Jason Van Dyke are growing. Activists behind the movement lay out their demands as he's set to be released. Plus, a rare opportunity to see the original 13th Amendment document that abolished slavery in person. The Future of Bronzeville, a new podcast, examines the neighborhood's transformation and what it could mean for residents.
Art can really be this active way of engaging both your mind but also your heart.
And a new exhibit explores the intersection of violence and art. First off tonight, former Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke is scheduled to be released from prison Thursday after serving 3 years behind bars. That's less than half of the nearly 7-year prison sentence he was given in 2019 for second-degree murder in the shooting death of teenager Laquan McDonald. Community activists and relatives of McDonald are now calling on the federal government to take action, demanding the Justice Department bring charges against Van Dyke for violating McDonald's civil rights. Joining us now with more are Tony Thedford, a criminal defense attorney in Chicago, Jasmine Salas with the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, and William Calloway, a community activist who's been on the forefront of demonstrations protesting Van Dyke's upcoming release. We also reached out to the U.S. Attorney's Office to ask about the federal charges. They declined to comment. William, let's start with you, please. Van Dyke served time for the charges that were brought by the state, but why do you think he should also face federal charges? William, I think you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that, you all. It's clear that Jason Van Dyke, under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 242, Jason Van Dyke violated Laquan McDonald's civil rights. Therefore, he should be prosecuted on a federal level. The punishment that he received by being handed down this light sentence of 81 months does not match the criminal act that he committed on October 20th, 2014. And furthermore, there's individuals in Cook County Jail that have spent more and that are spending more time in detention waiting to go to trial than what Jason Van Dyke has spent in the Illinois State Penitentiary. This is an injustice. This is a miscarriage of injustice if he's released, and we're going to continue to call for federal charges.
William, briefly give us, clarify for us why you believe his civil rights, Laquan McDonald's civil rights, were violated.
And I'm sure Attorney Tony could probably speak more to this, but the deprivation of rights under the color of law is a federal criminal offense. And your viewers can research that more, but that charge is what's applicable to the criminal act that Jason Van Dyke did. And the United States District Attorney knows that as well, and he should press charges immediately.
Jasmine, the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, you all are joining this call for federal charges. How are you working to get the attention of the U.S. Attorney here?
Well, so right now we're focusing on mobilizing our base of supporters as well as Black and brown folks all over Chicago. This is a cause that is extremely important. We all know that 81 months is not enough to fully hold Van Dyke accountable, and we know that there is a movement in this city that is the reason why Van Dyke is behind bars. So we are reactivating that movement. We are, of course, sending the letter to the Attorney General as well as to the Department of Justice, not just around the Van Dyke case, but around 49 other cases of police violence and police murders that have occurred in this city. We know that part of the reason why the Van Dyke case really rocked Chicago was because there have been so many Laquan McDonalds for decades. This is an issue in Black communities as well as Latino communities and in working class communities across the city. And so right now we're saying that Van Dyke needs to be held accountable, as well as the other killer cops who are out there committing crimes and acting as Van Dyke did on that night that he murdered Laquan. And so now we are mobilizing folks, and we're also organizing a rally on February 3rd at 5 p.m. at Federal Plaza, where we're going to deliver the letter to the U.S. Attorney directly.
Tony Thetford, in your legal opinion, what are the chances of federal charges being brought in this case?
Well, it's a matter of choice, not a matter of chances. I think the easiest way to equate this is going back years to the Rodney King incident back in the early 90s. The state court, the officers were tried in state court that had abused Rodney King. They were acquitted. The U.S. attorney in that district believed that that was an injustice. So they charged them and tried them federally for civil rights violations. And each of those officers were convicted and spent time in a federal penitentiary. That's kind of the equivalent of this. In fact, there is a trial happening right now in Minneapolis. The co-defendants of the other officers who were present when Derek Chauvin took the life of George Floyd. Those officers are being tried in federal court for civil rights violations. William was correct in terms of the section of the federal code that addresses the ability to charge one federally. In this circumstance, it really will come down to the choices made by U.S. Attorney's Office.
Of course. And just a few slight differences. You mentioned the Rodney King case. Those officers were acquitted entirely in state court. In the instance of the three officers in Minnesota, they are still facing state charges as well. And of course, we know former officer Derek Chauvin was convicted in state court. William versus, in this case, Officer Van Dyke was also convicted in state court. William, you're also calling on the Mag Mile Association to stand in solidarity with activists in calling for these federal charges as well. What are you hoping to accomplish by getting the association to participate?
I do want to acknowledge the Mag Mile Association. I had a meeting a little bit, I want to say a few days after we approached the Mag Mile and asked them for their help with President Kimberly Bears, and it was a great conversation. She definitely heard the concerns of the community. But we laid it out. We understand that the Mag Mile Association is an affluent retail corridor that has a lot of businesses from Louis, Burberry, Gucci, and these institutions and these establishments should speak up. They should speak out. And we don't want to be reactive. We don't want to wait till a possible civil unrest occur because it's misplaced anger in the community and the city explodes. We want to make sure that the Magnificent Mile uses everything or does everything that they can in their influence. We're using their voice, using the network, using their resources to make sure that the Department of Justice understand that Jason Van Dyke is a hazard to the Black community and to the community at large, and he should not be released. So we're leaning on them to use their voices.
And we also reached out to the Mag Mile Association, but we haven't received a response as of yet. So, Tony, Van Dyke was sentenced on the second-degree murder conviction, which carries a max sentence of 20 years. But he was also convicted on 16 counts of aggravated battery, one count for each of the 16 shots against McDonald. Each count carries up to 30 years. So, Tony, how did he end up getting 7 years and he's serving less than half of that time?
Well, what happens is that when there is a criminal conviction, and let's remember that a jury found him guilty of second-degree murder, they could have found him guilty of first-degree murder, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. But they did not. And again, this is no critique of the jury. I think that they made a choice based on what was in front of them. And they found him guilty of each of those 16 shots, a finding for each individual count. So that was hefty and a potential of a very heavy sentence. However, what happens is that those charges merged into what would have been the murder conviction. Because the murder conviction was second degree, that second degree murder conviction essentially takes precedent in terms of sentencing. So again, this court found that those charges should merge into the second degree murder count. thus giving him a maximum sentence of 20 years at 50%. You mentioned earlier that he was being released after only serving half of his sentence. I will say that any defendant in that situation would only serve 50% of their sentence because that, in fact, is the law in Illinois for a conviction of second-degree murder.
And,
So,
and Tony, sorry, I don't want to interrupt because we're almost out of time, but I want to get this last question to Jasmine. Of course, we know Van Dyke, he was convicted and sentenced, well before George Floyd's his death a couple of summers ago. Jasmine, in this world that we're in now, post George Floyd, when the social justice and the movement for racial equity has been hastened, do you think this sentence would be different had this occurred after George Floyd?
I think that possibility, I think that's a real possibility, Candace. I think definitely the uprising was the largest protest movement ever in our country's history. And it was in response to a lynching of a Black man. And I think a lot of people saw that footage of George Floyd losing his life and they were spurred to take action. And I think even though that movement has died down, people's consciousness and people's feelings towards police impunity is the same. People are frustrated, people are fed up, and I think definitely things could have been very different.
Okay. We'll have to leave it there. My thanks to William Calloway, Jasmine Salas, and Tony Thedford for joining us.
Thank you.
An original copy of the 13th Amendment has made its way to Chicago. Ratified in 1865, this document officially abolished slavery throughout the United States.
If you really think about this document, it was a seminal moment in our country's history. This document was signed by Speaker of the House Schuyler Colfax and Hannibal Hamlin, who was vice president, but he was also president of the Senate. And it was also signed by 107 members of Congress. And it was passed unanimously. And again, I state this emphatically that I believe, and many do believe, that it's the most important document to come out of the Lincoln administration.
The document is part of a President Lincoln era-inspired auction at Heritage Auctions in River North with an opening bid of $200,000. You can see the document in person through February 4th, free of charge. And up next, a look at Bronzeville's past and future. Stay with us. Bronzeville is rich with Black history and culture and has produced some of the nation's most influential figures like Ida B. Wells and Louis Armstrong. Known as the Black Metropolis, the neighborhood became a hub for African-American businesses in the early 1900s and has been a popular place to live, especially for Chicago's Black community. Now, a recent construction boom is replacing vacant lots with high-priced homes. And that transformation of the South Side neighborhood is the focus of a new podcast series just launched. Joining us now with more are Dennis Rodkin, the Crane Chicago business reporter behind the new podcast series, along with Pete Saunders, an urban planning consultant, and Sherry Williams, founder of the Bronzeville Historical Society. Thanks to you all for joining us. So Dennis, as a real estate reporter, you've been watching Bronzeville develop over these last few years. What are the changes that you were witnessing that made you want to create this podcast?
You know, there has been a boom in the sale of homes at $500,000 and up. And in the several years I've been watching it, that number has risen. We're now looking at a lot of sales at over $700,000 and $800,000. And there are some coming on the market this year at $950,000. That's not everything that sells in Bronzeville, but that is a real indicator that there's a luxury market that is filling up formerly vacant lots, lot by lot by lot throughout Bronzeville.
Sherry, you've lived in Bronzeville for about 20 years total. What brought you to the neighborhood and what keeps you there?
Initially, my coming to Bronzeville was my grandmother. She came here in 1942, also lived, worked, and worshiped in the same community. And so when I moved away, when I attended college, certainly it was home. So immediately I returned. So I've been based here for 4 generations now.
Okay. Pete, we've seen investment into Bronzeville pick up in recent years. Alderman Pat Dowell led an initiative in 2017 to turn vacant land into single-family homes. Bronzeville is also currently one of 10 priority communities selected in the city's Invest Southwest initiative. How is this investment and increased attention impacting the neighborhood?
Well, I think it's having a great impact right now. I think that ever since the Chicago Housing Authority developments were torn down in the late 90s, early 2000s, that kind of got rid of what was a huge social mistake in terms of the warehousing of people there. I think that there's been a great turn towards new housing coming into the area, more interest in the area, and more investment. Quite honestly, this started, in my opinion, before the housing crash of 2008. It was hurt by that, but I think that if that crisis had not happened, we would have seen much more housing development there. People are attracted to the lakefront. They like the amenities that are there, and that's the long and short of it.
Dennis, you call the changes that are happening in Bronzeville a quiet transformation. What do you mean by that?
Well, there are large-scale transformations that are also going on in Bronzeville. There was the removal of the CHA towers. There's the construction of the bridges, the 2 bridges over Lakeshore Drive. There is planning to redevelop the Michael Reese site campus. But this is quieter because, as I said, this is sort of lot by lot. This is one family moving into a house and another family moving into a house. Alderman Pat Dowell says that at the beginning of the 21st century, there were 3,000 empty lots in Bronzeville, more than in any other part of the city. And one by one, they're going away. The majority are still empty, but one by one, they're going away as these new houses, new townhouses, new condos are built. And so quietly, the neighborhood is changing very fast.
Sherry, are you concerned at all that the housing market in Bronzeville changing significantly enough to change the neighborhood?
Well, I mean, honestly, I'm not impressed with 100, 200 new houses being built that start in the market of 500,000 or above. There is existing housing that certainly has value way beyond that. And this would have been even before 2008, that there were homes that always exceeded past that price. That price point, I guess, would be impressive if it was more than 100 homes or so that were being built simultaneously. But for my heart, it's always been the needs of those who have been not represented well in new construction, and not just in Bronzeville. So certainly when we look at the plan for transformation, the promises that were made for residents who have been 3-4 generations in the community, none of that has been met, not nearly met in 20 years. And so when I see vacant lots, I see the potential for inclusion. And that means anyone who wants to live in the community and not those who have the money to purchase properties.
So you're concerned about
such a large price.
So you're concerned about the availability of affordable housing, especially given that previous housing developments had been closed and those neighbors displaced. Pete, what is the risk of residents being displaced or forced to move because Bronzeville may have become too expensive for them?
Well, the same as in any other neighborhood. I think that if left unchecked, that there will be people who will be forced out, but who won't be able to afford living in the community. However, I would say the flip side of that is you would end up with a community that does not get the investment that it deserves, that does not have the amenities that it deserves. And that's one thing that's happening right now. I think we need to find a balance between making this a safe, secure, sustainable community that appeals to people across the income spectrum, but also is a leader in affordability and is reaching out and in inclusion. So that it's reaching out to residents in that regard too.
Dennis, what do you want people to take away from your podcast?
I think there's an incredible intersection of real estate, the beat I cover, and history in Bronzeville. You talked about the incredible depth of cultural history in Bronzeville. There is also, Chicago is a city of homes, and our housing history from segregation to what's going on to public housing to what's going on today has all played out in Bronzeville.
Sherry, we've got about 10 seconds. What's the neighborhood's future look like for you?
It's very bright. I certainly see larger conversations happening. I'm certainly happy that Dennis has taken this challenge to make a platform for these conversations.
Okay. Well, that's where we'll have to leave it. My thanks to Dennis Rodkin, Sherry Williams, and Pete Saunders for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, a new art exhibit capturing more than 100 years of violence against African Americans. Stay with us. A new exhibit is exploring America's race relations dating back to the 1800s. The exhibit spotlights the country's racism in a visual history lesson, showcasing the intersection of violence and art, while also encouraging reflection. Arts correspondent Angel Edo shares a look at A Site of Struggle, American Art Against Anti-Black Violence, and a warning that some of the images are graphic.
Black art has always been a part of how history has been communicated.
A new exhibit at Northwestern University's Black Museum is reflecting on the country's history of race relations.
What the exhibition seeks to present are the different kinds of strategies that artists have used to engage this topic. So whether it's using direct depictions of violence, or using abstraction to avoid literal representations of violence. We want to showcase the range of approaches that artists have taken to this topic.
Comprised of more than 60 works across various mediums, the exhibit takes visitors through American history, starting in the 1890s and ending in 2013 at the start of the Black Lives Matter movement. Northwestern history professor Leslie Harris says art has always been critical to the anti-slavery movement.
The earliest anti-slavery activists, they hired artists to depict what everyone knows now, the famous cutaway of the ship, the Middle Passage ship. From a very early time in that struggle, just as one example, artists were engaged and actively involved in the politics of making it known that there was an injustice that was happening. That was at a time when you had much lower literacy rates also. So people had to rely sometimes on the visual to reach broad audiences because not everyone was reading the paper or picking up books.
From different interpretations of lynching to exploring the reality of living in the Jim Crow era, the exhibit features numerous works that, while graphic, engage in the politics of bringing racial injustices to the forefront of the conversation.
One of the oldest objects in the exhibition is actually an activist pamphlet from 1895 that was written by Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching activist that was based here in Chicago. And she is widely considered to be one of the first activists to appropriate lynching photography for the purpose of protesting lynching and making a wider awareness about this as a practice that needed to be eradicated.
With 2/3 of featured artists being of color and 1/3 not, Dees says both viewpoints are imperative to telling a complete story.
You can also see this history of solidarity, that there were white artists in the 20s and the 30s who lent their artwork to support activism by the NAACP, for example. So people can also kind of see this like genealogy of solidarity.
It's very appropriate for me to have this exhibition opening in time for Black History Month. Certainly we can celebrate, but we also have to recognize what so many people have gone through because of racism and what people continue to go through because of that. And so this exhibition really demonstrates that. But even more so, it demonstrates how artists have chosen to use their special tools and gifts to reach larger audiences on these issues and to have us all engage with them. And we can take from their example how we should each in our own lives think about what tools do we have to understand these histories, positive and negative, and how do we talk to our families, to our communities about them.
For Chicago Tonight Black Voices, I'm Angel Ito.
And you can see A Site of Struggle, American Art Against Anti-Black Violence at Northwestern University's Block Museum in Evanston through July 10th. And that's our show for this weekend. If you're watching us on Saturday night, know that you can also catch Black Voices and Latino Voices on Sundays beginning at 10 p.m. And join me next week at 7 on Chicago Tonight. Also next week, our next virtual community conversation is Monday night. We're talking about efforts to keep the story of Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley alive. I'll be joined by Till's cousin and 2 others who are helping with efforts to share their story. That's Monday night at 8. You can visit WTTW.com/events to RSVP. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight Black Voices, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thanks for sharing part of your weekend with us. Stay healthy and warm, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that supports free educational initiatives in the legal profession.